Okay, welcome to my office in the park. Today I want to take a look at something that gets some people in trouble, especially new Christians that are not very familiar with the Bible. They might know the basics about Jesus and the Christmas story and the resurrection and, the basics about the gospel, but maybe they don't know a whole lot about the Old Testament and the prophets. Now, what I want to take a look at here briefly is cryptic language in the Bible. And what I mean by that is oftentimes there's terms that are used that they're somewhat ambiguous. And what I mean by cryptic, oftentimes cryptic language is used to conceal maybe hidden meanings, or as in the case of cryptic language in war, it's so your enemy doesn't understand what you're talking about, right? Well, sometimes that was the way certain things were written in the Bible. The Jews, the prophets, wrote things in rhetorical language, sometimes using cryptic terms that meant something to the Jews. It meant something to people who were familiar with the Old Testament and the prophets, but it may have not meant anything to their enemies or the unbelievers or the novices. Okay, and one of the things that you run into, especially if you're dealing with the rainbow crowd, the LGBTQXYZ folks, is once in a while they will quote this verse to you. In Ezekiel 16, let's see, where should we start? This is the main verse here, verse 49. Look, this was the iniquity of your sister Sodom. She and her daughter had pride, fullness of food, abundance of idleness, neither did she strengthen the hand of the poor and needy. And they were haughty and committed abomination before me. Therefore I took them away as I saw fit. Okay, so there's no mention here of homosexuality. So they love this verse, see? But if you read the whole chapter, and this is what's important, see? Because if you don't read the whole chapter, you may not understand how this is being used. Okay, if you look at the first few verses, verse 1, now this is Ezekiel, a prophet, some 500 years or so before Christ. And he says, again, the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Son of man, cause Jerusalem to know her abominations. Okay, so then he goes on and he lists the sins of Jerusalem and Israel. Goes into great length for 40 some odd verses here. And I'm not going to read all of it. But the point is, it's leading up to something. And then when he gets down to the verse that I read, then he starts using, well, let me back up to, where does it start? Let's see. Well, let's start at verse 46. Your elder sister is Samaria, who dwells with her daughters to the north of you, and your younger sister, who dwells to the south of you, is Sodom and her daughters. Okay, so this is not talking about the Sodom that's mentioned in Genesis. I mean, in a literal sense. It's using figurative language here, cryptic language, using Sodom, which the Jews knew the history of God's judgment on Sodom. I mean, it was a famous story out of the book of Genesis, out of the first 5 books, right? And so the Jews understood that story. So when Ezekiel is basically shaking Jerusalem down and exposing her sins, it's quite an insult that he would apply this term to her. But that's basically what he's doing here. So, you don't even have to mention the problem with homosexuality and sodomy, but of course a sodomite is somebody that has, a man that has sex with a man. That's a sodomite. And that term comes from the Bible. It comes from the city of Sodom, right, in the Old Testament. But see, Ezekiel is writing hundreds, if not thousands of years after the fact. Yet everybody's aware of that story. So this is cryptic language. If you go on reading the rest of the chapter, it uses the term numerous times. Verse 53, for example, when I bring back their captives, the captives of Sodom and her daughters, the captives of Samaria and her daughters, then I will also bring back the captives of your captivity among them. And then skipping down to 55, when your sisters, Sodom and her daughters, return to their former state, Samaria and her daughters return to their former state, then you and your daughters will return to your former state. For your sister Sodom was not a byword in your mouth in the days of your pride, before your wickedness was uncovered. In other words, the people kind of had forgotten about it, you know. It wasn't something, a byword that people just said, oh, you remember what happened to Sodom? No, they kind of forgot all about it, see. So that's what you're dealing with. Another illustration that it's somewhat similar is in the book of Revelation, chapter 18. Now, the book of Revelation gets a lot of people in trouble. And the reason it does is because it uses all kinds of rhetoric that was used in the Old Testament prophets, Ezekiel, Isaiah, Jeremiah. And if you're not familiar with those books and the language that they used, you might not understand some of the things that the author is alluding to. And then it's also written in such a way that it can be applied to not just one specific time period, but it can be applied to a principle or an issue. Okay, so in Revelation 18, it says, after these things I saw another angel coming down from heaven, having great authority, and the earth was illuminated with his glory. And he cried mightily with a loud voice, saying, Babylon the Great is fallen, has become a dwelling place of demons, a prison for every foul spirit, a cage for every unclean and hateful bird. For all the nations have drunk of the wine of the wrath of her fornications. Okay, so here it's referring to Babylon, which hadn't existed for several thousand years. Okay, so how the people during the days of John, when he was writing this, how they may have looked at it was, of course, the Roman Empire had destroyed the temple, scattered the Jews all over the place, and they would have looked at this probably as God's judgment, obviously, but then they would have looked at it from a historical perspective that God used Babylon to judge Israel. So in the same way that God judged Israel at the hands of Babylon and the king Nebuchadnezzar, then he used the Romans to judge the Jews because they rejected the Messiah. Okay, so that's the way they would have looked at Rome. And if you fast forward to the days of the Reformation, that's quite often the way the people during the Reformation understood these verses. They understood it to be Rome. Okay, so now Rome is no longer a real issue. We've got other issues on our plate. We've got the Muslim problem, which didn't become a problem until the 6th or 7th century, and then now it's spread over the whole world. So now we could turn around and we could apply this to some degree to Islam as being a problem. Okay, now it doesn't literally fit in some places. But here we are having to do business in the oil industry with Arab nations that are oil rich. And, we've been doing this for, 100 years or more. And there's nothing wrong with that. However, when they become rich and we're in cahoots with them, that can become a problem. So the cryptic language of Babylon can speak to a lot of different things. So anyway, that's just a couple of things that are worth looking into. Learn something about the cryptic language or the rhetorical language of the prophets. and it will help you a lot in understanding what the Bible's talking about.